If you think the Vortex helps you get things in focus, try becoming a premium member on RealCatholicTV.com for the best shows on earth. The benefits are out of this world.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris. History is not arbitrary, it's shaped by great movements. These movements give impetus to one another as history unfolds. They cause great undulations within civilizations, eventually bringing the end of one civilization and the birth of the next. The individuals who give rise to these great movements in thought, for all of man's accomplishments and downfalls always begin in the mind, are motivated by a variety of factors such as cultural, political, economic, social, and religious. All of these factors overlap one another and sometimes are in conflict with each other, producing wars or great political upheavals. One need only look back on the Crusades or the so-called Reformation, the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, or the 20th century's two world wars to witness what can happen when these varying movements with their interplay of various causes are set in competition with each other. Nothing appears suddenly out of nowhere. It enters onto the world stage because the great drama of humanity has been practicing and preparing for it for decades or even centuries beforehand. Much like a stage production where sets and actors and costumes are all busily preparing for the next scene while the current act is still being played out. But the first act and the second act are not unrelated. One flows from the other. And they are each managed into reality, brought onto the main stage from the backstage by producers and directors working unseen, out of sight of the audience. This is so with the great human drama as well. Nothing happens without God's will, be it His active will or His passive will. His passive will allows, does not predestine, but allows certain events to unfold and run their course. His active will directly intervenes and participates in creation. For example, each one of you is alive at this moment and watching this vortex because God directly intervened in the affairs of man and caused you to come into existence. And not just existence, but this existence in this time and place and these circumstances. None of us chose to exist, but God chose for us to exist. This necessarily means that we each have a destiny, the reason for which we were created. This means, again by definition, that there is a goal to which each one of us should be striving because it is our destiny. If you believe in a supreme being, then all of this necessarily flows. A supreme being could only create out of love ordered to his creation. Being supreme, he neither needed anything nor required anything for himself because he's supreme within himself. Now, as a quick aside, for the atheists, this philosophy is rejected immediately. But for the atheist, a different set of thoughts and questions and propositions need to be discussed. Like, for example, why is there existence at all? Or even more probing, what is that underlies the very laws of the universe which hold the universe together? But all of those are for another vortex. If someone says they believe in God, then he or she must absolutely accept the truth that they have a destiny, the end for which they exist, their whole reason for being. So why is it then that so many people who say they believe in God wander around life so aimlessly? They either have an incorrect notion of God, themselves, or their lives and circumstances, or possibly all three. The phrase which became popular in the 1970s and 80s summed up this quite neatly. People had to find themselves. An entire industry was born labeled self-help, a kitschy phrase if there ever was one. It implies that all the answers to one's difficulties lay hidden deep within the person. If that's true, society as a whole has done quite a miserable job of discovering those solutions. If we were created by a supreme being who is outside of his creation, which he quite obviously is since he pre-existed it, then wouldn't it make sense for us to look to the supreme being for the answers to life's difficulties rather than rooting around in our personal basements of tragedy and pain? This intense hunting around into the pain of humanity on the part of certain individuals in history is precisely what has initiated the great movements of history. Men have wanted and desired freedom, equality, justice, the lack of which in their own individual lives they have been acutely aware, right or wrong. So some, a few down through the ages, who have been talented or gifted enough to be able to articulate those ideas, convince others of them, and then gather armies of one sort or another around them and give rise to these great movements, each born of a great longing. It is in fact the greatness of the longing which has given the movements their greatness. Each individual person finds himself swept up, you and I, swept up in either the current great movement or the one that is about to emerge. And knowingly or not, we begin our lives, we live our lives carried along by this great movement or reacting against it. It is against this backdrop that any believer must discern his destiny and then move toward it. But the current movement of our time is unlike any other in history. It is the great movement of indifference, defined by the ignoring of the fact that we have destinies at all. It doesn't really care if people acknowledge the possibility of a supreme being so long as they never pay any intellectual attention to what that awesome reality entails. The existence of God is viewed as a kind of cultural artifact, a bit of nostalgia from bygone days that is probably rooted in some reality somewhere out there in the darkness of the cosmos, but has no real bearing in my life, certainly not day to day. The Catholic Church in the West, both her leaders and laity, but especially many of her leaders, have failed to recognize this latest movement of human history. The indifference has resulted in a massive diminishing of faith, and this lack of faith is the cause of much of our modern woes. Just ask any bishop for the real reason he has to close dozens and dozens of parishes. Leaders and laity who understand the current crisis must confront this indifference head on. They can no longer fear recriminations of intolerance or judgmentalism or lack of charity, for these are the accusations that will naturally arise from the indifferent class. The only thing that the indifferent are not indifferent to is hearing the truth. That they will not allow. Anything else is allowable. This is the landscape of the current culture, and this is what Catholics need to understand. As George Orwell put it famously, quote, "During times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act." God love you. I'm Michael Voris.